Thus, as it has already been very justly pointed out, it was not the national wish, nor the authority of the rights of legitimacy, nor the title of a family to the crown which reestablished the throne in the elder branch of the Bourbon, but it was the mere goodwill and pleasure of two foreign monarchs, assisted by an Austrian general who, without the nation's knowledge, opened the doors of France to King Louis XVIII and set him on the throne. The declaration of the Allies, which Michau, the printer, had waited for in an adjoining drawing room, had been printed and posted in Paris without loss of time. It remained to be decided what government should replace the government with these intrigues, and this juggling had overthrown a certain number of royalists who had surrounded the Emperor Alexander from the moment of his arrival at the Prince de Benevento. Talleyrand's house implored him to give them back their old masters. The Municipal Council of Paris, through the mouthpiece of its president, Bayard, had expressed a wish that the Bourbons might be recalled. The Emperor of Russia had not yet expressed his opinion. The Emperor Napoleon, possessed in the person of the Duc de Vicence-Caulaincourt, an advocate whose zeal and devotion no difficulty could cool. As to Prince de Benevento, he had burnt his ships behind him. Unwilling and unable to remain behind, he had convoked the Senate. The result of the deliberations of this assembly had been the appointment of a government commission charged with the administration and the drawing up of a draft of the Constitution. This provisional government had Prince de Benevento at its head as president, and as members, General Bournonville, Duke d'Alberg, Senator Jaucourt, and Abbé Montesquieu. The general of division, Bournonville, surnamed the French Ajax in Dumouriez's army, and who was known by the exaggeration of one of his reports in which he related that the enemy had lost 10,000 men, and that the loss of the French consisted in the little finger of a chasseur, had been loaded with dignity and favors both in the army and in diplomacy by the imperial government. General Bournonville had left Monsieur Lavalette very late in the evening of March 31st. They had been deploring together the fatal events which had just occurred and had agreed to meet again on the morrow morning. On arriving at Bournonville's house, Lavalette heard that the general had been sent for during the night to Prince de Benevento's. For what reason was explained to him by the list of members of the provisional government. Talleyrand needed a general in the provisional government and had chosen his man well. General Bournonville displayed the greatest zeal. Duke d'Alberg, of whom we have already had occasion to speak, nephew of the Prince Primate, at first ambassador of Baden in Paris, afterwards naturalized. By the grace of Napoleon, created a duke, counselor of state, and married to Mademoiselle Brignole, with an endowment of 4 million francs, was also reaping the reward of his perfidy towards the sovereign who had so generously adopted him. Monsieur de Jaucourt had drawn attention to himself at the Constitutional Assembly and later on at the Senate by the liberalism of his principles and by his honorable character. Taken up and protected by King Joseph, he had been drawn away by old remembrances and by 25 years' relationship with Monsieur de Talleyrand, a friendship which had never been interrupted even during the exile. The fifth member of the provisional government was Abbé, afterwards Duc de Montesquieu, formerly agent general of the clergy and member of the National Assembly, where he defended the privileges of his order with apparent moderation and with energy. He had served the interests of the Bourbons under the consulate and under the empire with zeal. He had been the agent in 1800 in the application made by the Comte de Lille to the first consul. Exiled at first, he obtained without difficulty, and in spite of his suspicious conduct, permission to return to Paris, where he lived in obscurity until the occurrences of 1814. He was on good terms with the family of Count de Montesquieu, the Grand Chamberlain, who protected him with the imperial government. Abbé de Montesquieu used sometimes to go and see the King of Rome's governess. During one of these visits, he had begged his cousin to show him the emperor without being seen. To oblige him, Madame de Montesquieu placed him where he could see Napoleon crossing a gallery. The abbé, having looked at him with attention, could not help murmuring between his teeth, yet loud enough for his cousin to hear him, "Will no one deliver us from this little man?" Madame de Montesquieu, rather disturbed by the perseverance of this hatred hidden under gentle and inoffensive appearances, treated her relation with the greatest circumspection and prudence in the future. Prince de Benevento, whose greatest skill always consisted in turning events to his profit and giving the last blow to the different governments who employed him, when fortune abandoned them, made use of a corporation which bore the title of conservative to consummate the emperor's ruin. This corporation, to which Napoleon, in his order of the day of April 4th, addressed to the army, made such just and such killing reproaches, disposed of the government of France without having the authority to do so, and was careful not to forget in its draft of a constitution to stipulate for the permanent enjoyment of its salaries and the privileges which it had received from the emperor himself. The legislative body adhered to all the acts of the Senate. The nucleus of deputies was got together to represent this assembly some way or other. It was completed later on. Whatever it may have done, it was anticipated and excelled in servility by the Senate. A torrent of insults, libels, and calumnies of all sorts suddenly took the place of the demonstrations of respect and the protestations of devotion towards the emperor, who only the day before had been incensed to the extent of adulation. Every feeling of decency and respect was from that time cast aside by the majority of the corporations of the state. To many intelligent and impartial minds, Napoleon was at that time our only chance of safety. Those who, not understanding this, separated from him, had the right to abandon him when by patriotism he abandoned himself, but to lose all dignity in this common misfortune, to throw themselves at the feet of foreigners, to give a display of total want of decency and desertion to insulted genius who had been smitten by adversity. These are things which we regret to have seen and which will long live amongst us in sorrowful remembrance. The national character will not be stained by these things, because it can rightly be said that this deplorable error was the error only of some individuals, and that unlike them, the nation did not insult nor repudiate the master when the day of misfortune came upon him. In considering with greater coolness the desertions which took place at this painful time, one sees there a new example of the inevitable effect of reactions, which is to raise up around a man who has held great power and who has fallen, traducers of every kind. It is not from contemporaries, who are always actuated by more or less vivacious passions, that one can expect an impartial judgment. In their eyes, the greatness of the genius and of the character of the man who has presided over important events which they witness has always a contestable greatness, and even those who have taken no part in these events are infinitely more prone than others to severity and to criticism. Most of the persons to whom I am alluding yoked themselves to the chariot of a new master, trampling beneath their feet the idol whom they had so long incensed, in order to preserve the estates, the honors, and the advantages with which the imperial government had loaded them. For these turncoats of honor, Napoleon's unpardonable crime was to have lost, together with his power, all means of exercising his generosity in their favor. There are some people who do not forgive a reproach which they have merited, or who think they have not been sufficiently recompensed for their services. Certain generals, certain administrators in whom the old jealousies of the army of the Rhine fermented, or who regretted the favors of those who had formerly been in power. Certain others who were imbued with Republican or indeed Royalist opinions gave vent at the sight of the fallen Colossus to hostile sentiments which till then they had very carefully kept down in the remotest recess of their hearts. Napoleon would not admit that any obstacles were insurmountable. He would not accept the excuses of those who pleaded such obstacles in justification of their failure. This incredulity on his part was only feigned, but he considered it useful and even necessary to keep alive what he used to call the sacred fire amongst those whom he used for objects which audacity alone could attain. Those only saw in his conduct a gratuitous injustice, forgetting that in the face of the resistance which crossed his plans, Napoleon would have wished to have effaced the word impossible from the French dictionary. At the same time, if he placed his confidence in those whose assertions he distinctly contradicted, this proved to them that they had not deserved ill in his eyes, and that he on his side did not cease to appreciate their talents and their fidelity. The emperor indeed took into account, as occasion might be, all the goodwill which had been displayed in his service, but the reward of the moment, the tacit reparation accorded by Napoleon, did not efface in the eyes of some the injustice of the reproaches to which they had formerly been exposed. There may still be met today men who have kept up these old grudges, probably finding in these childish sufferings of their vanity a plausible excuse for their desertion. A certain number of persons bore Napoleon a grudge for not having appreciated the wisdom of their advice and for having opposed their calculations and crossed their views for the future in the accomplishment of his designs. Others, no doubt, with more susceptible but not more equitable feeling, remembered that their demonstrations of devotion had not always been received with the show of sympathy proportionate to the outward signs of their assiduity. Those, however, ought to recognize the fact they suffered no harm thereby, that the mind unconsciously possesses mysterious instincts which attract or repel, but which in no way bring about any alteration in point of esteem and confidence. Do not their tardy complaints on this head tend to prove that their devotion was not really very sincere? The emperor's disapproval of certain alliances which had been contracted by people whom he liked, with families who were rich but not respected, excited the resentment of those who had contracted these marriages. But he was prompted by the fear lest the respectability of the corporations to which they belonged might in some way be attained. If promotion for certain people was not as rapid as they might have hoped, instead of attributing this to want of opportunities, they blamed the emperor for having treated them unjustly. It would, however, be difficult to mention genuine examples of real services or of acknowledged talents which were neglected by Napoleon, even in the case of men whom he had authorized to consider his enemies. No considerations of a man's opinions nor of wrongs he might have committed against him ever made him deviate from his rule of leaving no kind of merit without employment, that is to say, without reward. A longer enumeration of the causes which raised up enemies for Napoleon amongst those who served him would be superfluous, when in order to rescue France from the tyrannical pretensions of England and to replace her in the rank whence the successive aggrandizements of her neighbors tended to bring her down, Napoleon charged himself with labors, with privations, with dangers of every kind, when he renounced all the pleasures of life and disdained that material comfort which even the loftiest minds sometimes need, when he exposed himself to temporary unpopularity in order to assure the success of plans fertile in the great future results, the secrets thereof being alone known to him. He had a right to exact the same sacrifices from those he employed. If he was exacting, he was more so towards himself than towards others. I have pointed out the wrongs committed by such of Napoleon's antagonists, as I may call his domestic enemies. I will not undertake to define the numerous varieties of adversaries to whose passions and feelings the fall of the imperial government gave a free field. The principal head of indictment in which they unite against the emperor is that after the splendid victories which he gained over the coalition, he did not relax the springs of his dictatorial government. They will not recognize the understanding which existed amongst our enemies, nor the persevering system of hostilities of that coalition whose immense resources enabled it to repair its losses and unceasingly recommence the struggle. It was not whilst in the face of numerous active enemies constantly springing up afresh that Napoleon could indulge in such experiments as the extension of political liberties. These reproaches springing from bad faith, from ignorance, or from want of sense. We have seen them serving the hatred and the implacable rancor of the foreign powers, associating themselves with the interested passions of the princes and courtiers following in their train. And this concert of complaints and recriminations, which are but little justified, has created a current of opinion hostile to the emperor in accrediting calumnies with which for a long time the present generation has been duped in France as well as abroad. The contagion of these feelings of opposition to the unhappy emperor has not spared the majority of the leaders of the army. Instead of answering Napoleon's vibrating appeal, they forced him to abdicate. The emperor had consented to this sacrifice in order to protect the rights of his son, the Duc de Vicence, to whom the emperor added the title Duc de Ragusa and Prince de la Muscova, and in the absence of the former, Duc de Tarente, were charged by Napoleon to carry this document to the Allied sovereigns. But Marmont, on whose attachment he thought he could rely in days of adversity, urged on by the fatality which seemed to weigh upon his name, abandoned the French eagles at this moment. Monsieur Lafitte, pressed by the firm of La Sabatie of Bordeaux to make the Duc de Ragusa's family act upon him, had persuaded the marshal's brother-in-law a few days before to go to him, so that he might point out to him the uselessness of any further resistance. This seed of insubordination fell on a soil which was not prepared at that time to receive it, but it later on bore fruits. Marshal Marmont's desertion was a mortal blow to the imperial cause. It decided the Emperor Alexander, who till then had appeared to hesitate on the question of a regency, to exact in the name of the Allied powers the unconditional abdication of the emperor. This notification was handed to the French imperial plenipotentiaries in the night of April 4th. On the 6th, document by which Louis XVIII was recalled to the throne of France was published in Paris. The unexpected return of the Bourbons to France after an exile of 25 years naturally makes one think of the vicissitudes which this prince experienced during that long period. Louis XVIII, who was at that time known by the name of Count de Lille, had at first gone to Mitau in the month of March 1798 on the invitation which had been made to him by Tsar Paul I, out of hatred for the French Revolution. But his sentiments for Louis XVIII changing completely, he very roughly sent him a command to leave Russian territory. The Emperor Alexander, having broken off with France, re-established only 4 years after this expulsion the pension of 200,000 rubles, which his father had granted to Count de Lille, and invited the prince to return to Mitau at the time of the conclusion of the Tilsit peace. Count de Lille left Mitau suddenly. The variations of Russian politics were, during 10 years, the thermometer of favor or the disfavor in which the head of the House of Bourbon was held. Count de Lille had left Mitau without having been asked to do so by Alexander, but the Tsar, in transmitting to the Emperor Napoleon the news of the prince's departure, informed him at the same time that he did not know what had prompted it. Napoleon sent word to Alexander that he attached very little importance to the Pretenders' movements, and that he would very gladly give him Versailles to live in if the Count de Lille cared to come to France. The future king of France afterwards went and established himself in England, but did not receive the authorization to reside in London. He afterwards went to settle himself at Hartwell, where he hired the mansion and remained there until 1814, at the time when he returned to France.